Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. We've made it through another week. I'm excited for the weekend. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. If you're on Twitter, hello as well. No chat over there, so if you do want to chat along, head on over to behance.net/Adobe Live. We got Masayu and Cody and Wade, Brett, Steven, Z by HP, or Rick. Your name is Rick. Anita from Toronto. Who else do we have? Mohammed, Anika, and great to see Abir. Great to see all of you. Hey, Megan and Steven, Paul. Awesome. All right, so Masterclass number 48. We've been at this for 48 weeks, and many of you have been with me since week number 1. I can't thank you all enough. And here's to another 48 weeks, I suppose, right? Christine from Hamilton. Megan says, go Oilers. Where's the ban button on this? I'm kidding. Go Leafs, go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hop over to my screen, and we are going to get started with today's Masterclass. So if you follow me on Dribbble, I think I also posted this on Instagram and Twitter as well. I've been experimenting with typefaces lately. I've been on a typeface kick. And, typically I use a very sans serif typeface. But this one, it's different. It's fun. I think this is New Kansas. And I found that on Adobe Fonts. We might integrate that into today's design. But we're going to start to build out a TV experience, media browsing, that sort of thing, right? We're going to be building that out in XD. And it's gonna be a lot of fun. If anyone has questions, definitely throw that in the chat. I will be taking a peek from time to time. We've got Katya from Austria, Afrosia, Paco, yes, fresh new background. Well, not there, I'm in the other shot. Yeah, I've been working on my office some more. Been having a lot of fun. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and hop over to Adobe XD. And we are going to get going. So I'm going to start off with a brand new document. And since I am designing this specifically for televisions, I'm going to start with a 1920 by 1080 pixel artboard. Of course, you can start larger, you can start smaller, completely up to you. But the main importance when you're designing for a screen like this, also desktop, is that it's 16 by 9, because the majority of our displays that we're looking at on our desktops and also our televisions, not all of them, but the majority are 16 by 9. And 1920 by 1080 is a pretty good starting point. So I'm going to name this artboard just to get going. And what we're going to do is we're going to start laying out our design. So I'm thinking on this particular design, we're going to have a few featured shows at the top right here that we'll be able to scroll between, and then maybe some categories at the bottom. So we're going to start there, and then we'll see how far we get. And if anyone has suggestions on what we should be adding to media browsing experiences for television, definitely let me know. I'm also going to grab the rectangle to start, and I'm going to just add in a very somewhat thin rectangle. And the reason I'm doing this is I want a nice distinct separation between the content at the top and the content at the bottom. There's gonna be a little bit of overlapping going on. So we'll see how this plays out. So we have this background in place, and just to keep things organized, I'm just gonna name this background. And then we might wanna start building out our first show. So I'm gonna grab the rectangle tool, shortcut key R one more time, and drag one on out. And I'm gonna have a little bit of overlap right about here. Now, maybe to help things align a little bit better, I might want to start adding some guides. So from the left-hand side or the top as well, I can just drag out a guide. It'll snap to the side. Now, right now it's about 45 pixels. I'm gonna actually drop it to about 40, just so we're sticking with that 8 pixel grid. It's not necessary, but it's good practice, especially if you're working with developers who are very particular on certain grids. All right, Leo is saying Avalanche. Are you referring to the Colorado Avalanche? They're doing very well this season. All right, so we've got our first image, or our first rectangle. And what I want to do now is place an image into this rectangle. So I'm going to hop over to Finder or Explorer on Windows, And I have a bunch of space images that I've been collecting from Adobe stock. I'm gonna grab this one here, drag it directly in, and I'm thinking I might want the astronaut on the left. Well, I want her on the right. That's what left, right, whatever. So I'm gonna go ahead in my properties inspector and flip it over. Now, what I can also do is I can double click on it to access our mask. I can just pull this up a little bit so we have more of her face in there. And that looks pretty good. Now, we might find ourselves in a situation where the background might be a little bit too light for some of the content we're gonna put on top of it. So if we do find ourselves in that situation, we can definitely go ahead and make some changes to this image. Masayu is saying, I have a question. What is the difference between the value of plus minus Z depth in 3D? Oh, okay. So what you're referring to is inside of the properties inspector, we have our 3D transforms. And in here, we have a few different fields. We can rotate on the X-axis, Y-axis. We can rotate around in a circle, Z rotation basically, like we can do without 3D transforms. But we also have the Z depth, which I believe is what you're referring to. So what that's going to do is if I grab the handle in the middle of this particular rectangle and pull it forward, it's going to bring it forward towards me, right? And I can pull it backwards. And you're going to notice, because we have that shape back there, which by default has a Z depth of 0, it pushed it behind it. Now, one of the cool things that you can do with the Z depth option, right, is if you had objects that you always want to remain on top. Let's say you have a menu that has to be on top at all times, right? Let's say this is a menu. I don't know what this is, but we're going to say it's a menu, right? And what I'm going to do is in my layers panel, I'm actually going to move it behind all these other layers. Because in some cases, it might be part of a component. It might be a component itself, excuse me. It might be, part of another group. So what we can do is we can actually activate 3D transforms and set the Z depth at 1. And you're going to notice, even though that particular shape is behind all of the other shapes inside of the layer stack, because we set the Z depth higher than all the other layers, it's now always going to remain visible. So if I did go ahead and grab my rectangle or my ellipse or whatever and drag out another shape, right? This shape is technically on top in the layer stack, but because by default it has a Z depth of 0, it's actually displaying behind. So even if you're not working with actual 3D transforms, you can use Z depth to your advantage to kind of put things, layer things a little bit, have more flexibility when you're layering things. All right, so hopefully that answered your question. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna start adding some content over top on this side on the left. So I'm gonna grab the text tool, shortcut key T, and I'm gonna type out the Sands of Time. And this is a reference to Comic Sans, possibly. It makes it a little bit larger. And I can also, let me actually dive in here, lowercase that. And so I mentioned earlier that we were exploring the new, I think it was Kansas New actually, Kansas New. It's a really interesting typeface. It has a little bit of style to it. Obviously, it's not something you're going to use all the time in all of your projects, but it's kind of fun, right? Another one I was experimenting with is Montserrat, and then they have the alternative version. So if you take a look, right, there's the alternative and there's the regular. So some of the letters have fun little curves on them, which is also interesting, right? Is Z depth the equivalent of Z index in web development? Yes. So same deal, right? If you set the Z index on your websites, if you go inspect element or CSS or whatever, if you set it at 1 or, let's say you set it at 900, it's going to go above all the other layers below it. All right, so let me know in the chat, do you prefer New Kansas over here, or Kansas New, or Montserrat Alternative on the right? Tiago's saying you should call it Poppins, the Sands of Time. I like that. It's interesting. All right, so let me know in the chat. While I'm doing that, or while you're letting me know, I'm going to grab my text tool again, drag one out, and this is going to be the description. Now, this I'm going to make much smaller. Let's start with 24. We'll see how that goes. And I'm actually going to grab some copy that I have, just so I don't waste too much time. There we go. All right, Montserrat, Kansas. Ooh, all right, it's getting close, 2-1. Kansas, oh, now we're tied. Interesting. Oh, Montserrat, Kansas. Oh, It is way too close. I wish we had polls so we can just like throw a poll up on the screen. That'd be cool. Behance, if you're watching, add polls. All right, Montserrat. Oh my gosh, it's close. Okay, we're gonna go for Montserrat only because, you know, if I were to go for Kansas new here, it's gonna be a little bit difficult to read when it gets smaller. So I'm gonna stick with this. And I think 24 looks pretty good, but we might wanna drop the weight to, let's say, medium or maybe, possibly. We'll see. I'm gonna drag this out. We've got some nice puns in. Oh my, now we have a bunch for Kansas coming in. I can't keep track. Maybe one of the mods, if you can. There's a lot going on in there. All right, so we're going to leave this about here. And then above here, we might want some additional information about this particular show. So I'm gonna duplicate this one up. But I'm gonna do something like, whoops. Let's say sci-fi drama. And then over to the right, we might want how many episodes. And then maybe when it was released, 2021. And then we're gonna have something else over here to the right as well. But I may also want maybe some separators. So I'm gonna grab the ellipse, drag out a very simple separator. Now I'm not too concerned right now about how things are lining up. We're gonna add a stack in just a moment. So I'm just kind of eyeballing things. It looks fine for now. And then over here, we might want to indicate that this is an HD series, right? So I'm gonna grab the rectangle, draw one out. We'll round out the corners ever so slightly. 4 pixels should work. It's a very small shape, so you don't want to go too crazy with this. Maybe I'll bump up the size of the border. Maybe I'll bump this to bold. Take a quick peek, and I think that could almost work. There we go. Perfect. So let's do some organizing. I'm going to make sure to group this. I'm going to call this HD. And do we have any played by Helvetica? Oh, Cody caught it. I'll let some of you read this while I'm organizing some of these layers. So I'm also going to grab all the layers that make up this row here, right? I'm going to grab them all just by holding down Shift and clicking. I am going to align them, and I'm going to pop them into a group. I'm going to call this, let's say, metadata. Just like that. Now, what we want to do to make sure we can very easily align them and rearrange them is within the properties inspector over to the right, we're going to turn on a stack. And this will allow us to dive in here, either directly on our canvas or directly here. And let's go for 24, for example, right? And it's going to space everything out beautifully. That might be a little bit too much. Let's dive down to 16, if I can find the 6 on my keyboard. Beautiful. And this will also allow me to just grab some of these and shift them around. So maybe I wanted HD, for example, over here. Or if I wanted an additional dot or separator, duplicate and beautiful. And it keeps that 24 pixels. Love the description. Yeah, it was fun. I have a few more that we'll eventually get to, but it was fun. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's take a quick peek at how things are looking. That could work. I think I might want to, maybe just so we have only 3 lines, just bring this outwards. Something like that, just so we have a little bit more room down here, because eventually, you know, at first this is going to be masked, but we're going to have some buttons, and when this particular series is tapped on, it'll expand to show more information, some episodes, some buttons, additional things that you can do. So to help with that, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the rectangle, and let's draw out our first button. And this can be a fairly simple button. It'd be a nice rectangle, and then over top of it, we're going to type out watch now. Whoops. All right, and let's go for a nice blue in the background. Let's bump this up. Let's try 16. That could work. The blue might be a little bit too light, so I'm going to just drop it down a touch. There we go. And that looks pretty good. Now I am going to left align this particular text layer. And you might be wondering, you know, it's centered in this button. Why are we left aligning it? And let me show you why. What we're going to do is we're going to turn this into a component so that we can use multiple of these buttons across many artboards or many cards, right? And we can also create various states. So I have both these layers selected. I'm going to create a component directly in my properties inspector, or you can do it in your document assets, just like that. I'm going to name this episode or series button. And now what we want to do is turn on padding within the properties inspector. And if you haven't used padding yet, what's going to happen is when you turn that on, XD is going to look at the background layer, which is the layer, the group, the mask, the component at the very back of the layer stack inside of this component. And it's going to look at the layers on top of it. It's going to automatically set the padding for us, right? And you can tell inside of the properties inspector, we have our padding. And we can always dive in here. 13 is probably not the best bet, but we're going to keep it for now. And let's say on the sides we wanted, do we want to go up to 24? Let's try. It's not bad. It'll do, right? But what we can also do, and you'll see this in a moment, is when we create a new state, which we're going to do right now, which I'm going to call outlined, I'm going to dive in here. Let's go ahead and turn off the fill. We'll set a border color to white, bump this up in size a touch, and set this to white as well. Now, because we've enabled padding on the default state on the main component, which we're editing right now, if I want to change the text to, let's say, I don't know, download, right? You're going to notice the background is automatically resizing, which is wonderful. Or watch trailer. And this one I can maybe go just do play, for example, right? So we have both of our states. And now what we can do, just to really take this up another notch, is take this series button, pop it into a group. I'm going to call this buttons. I'm going to turn a stack on. Now, because there's only one layer or group, or in this case component, inside of the stack, it automatically defined it as horizontal. However, if there were more going maybe down, then it would take note of that and it would define it as vertical. All right, what's the shortcut to run the prototype? Oh, so it's Command Return on the Mac or Control Return, or is it Enter on Windows? I don't have a Windows, I don't have a keyboard with, I don't have a Windows machine on me, but it's one of those. Command Return on the Mac. So I have a stack turned on, and now I can dive in here, select this button, duplicate, and switch over, right? And if I did decide to change this to play series, series, once I accept, it's going to automatically push that button out of the way. All right. So we're starting to see what I mentioned earlier, right? We have this image in the background, and some of it is dark, especially at the top, but some of it down here is a little bit too light. So we have the text over top of it. For the most part, we can read it, but there are some areas that we cannot read. And before I get to that, I do want to make sure, I just want to bump up the size of this border just a little bit. All right, so we want to make sure that over here, it's a little bit darker. So what I'm going to do, there's a few ways to do this, right? One way we can do this is, let's say we can duplicate this shape, or you can create a new rectangle. You can add a linear gradient, something like this, and drop the opacity. So that's one way you can do it. But of course, because we have this astronaut over to the right, because that, that gradient is at the bottom, it's kind of darkening her as well, and we can't really see her. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select this image, right click, and let's dive into Photoshop for a few minutes. I know, right? Photoshop in an XD masterclass. Here we go. So we're going to make some simple changes. And it was this area here that was a little bit darker. So very simply, we can go ahead and add, let's say, a gradient. I don't use Photoshop often anymore, but here we go. We can add a gradient, and we're just going to keep it very simple. Dark gradient, and then on this side, we're also going to do dark. That looks pretty good. We'll change this over to this side. Maybe we'll actually do it on a bit of an angle. And then to ensure that the astronaut is not getting darkened a little bit or hidden, we have our layer mask right over here to the right. I'm going to just grab my gradient tool, use the black, and then just kind of mask that out a little bit, right? There we go. So we have a little bit of a darker area. One other thing we can do, because we're in Photoshop, is we can start compositing different images. So let me hide this for a moment. I'm going to hop back over to Finder, and we have this image over here, which does contain this moon at the top left-hand corner, which I might want to pull into this photo, right? So I'm going to drag this directly in, and let's give it a second. I'm going to make it nice and large. Woo, that was a bit too big. Hold on. View, that's better. Just like that, right? And I might want to flip this around, transform, flip horizontal. So I might want the moon somewhere in this area here, right? And then I'm gonna go ahead and add a layer mask to this particular shape. And just like I did before, mask some of it out. There we go. I could possibly even keep some of this earth down here. It's kind of interesting. But we do have now a nice darker area. This part in particular might give us some problems. So we might want to grab our brush or our gradient again. Maybe get rid of some of that, possibly. I don't know, I kind of like it. It's interesting, right? We shall see. So what we can do now is simply hit save, Command and Control S. It's not a crazy edit, so it should be pretty quick. And then if we go back to Adobe XD, you're gonna notice the edit is already there. Now, of course, because I have it masked inside of a smaller shape, we kind of see some issues, right? So we can kind of keep tweaking this. Maybe move this down a little bit, move this moon over. I'm thinking that I'm assuming that's Earth at the bottom left. That might be causing some problems. Now, what we can also do is simply mask everything out and just have our little moon. Let me delete this for a second. Grab the marquee tool, make sure it's a circular marquee tool. Whoop. There we go. And I will mask that. All right, now we have a moon. But of course we need our gradient, or what we can do if we have images of just stars, which I believe I do. I have some dark stars. That one's interesting. That one might be a bit too busy. That one's not bad. I want something nice and simple, but also dark enough that we can make that text a little bit legible. That one's not bad. Let's try this one. So I'm gonna bring this one in. This is turning into a Photoshop masterclass. Sorry, Paul. Let's mask this again. Right, there we go. All right, save it on up. And there we go. Now, of course, because we edited it back in Photoshop and it edited the original, we have to simply dive in here and just flip it on over. But we have a little bit of a better deal, right? Now, some of the stars in the background are a little bit they're a little bit too bright. So what we can do, let me dive in here. I might want to just darken the stars a little bit. So maybe I can use the blend if at the bottom, maybe blend out some of the stars, possibly. Or I can also, let's add, what should we do? How do we do this? We can darken the opacity a little bit, just bring that down. There's a lot of different ways to get, kind of drop the brightness. Of course, you can start using things like curves, possibly. Let's see if that helps at all. Darken that. Maybe. But you get the idea, right? And of course, we can bring back our gradient fill. And maybe we don't need it as dark. So I'll just drop it a touch. There we go. Make sure the moon's on top. Save it one more time. Oh, someone's asking about the object selection tool. I don't use it often. I should though. I love it. It usually works. And if you're not familiar with the object selection tool, let's actually go back to our moon. Delete layer mask, right? So we have our moon here. Right over here in Photoshop. Not that one. Not that one. This one. We have our object selection tool. Fairly new. And you can just drag a box over top of the moon and it's going to, for the most part, do a good job at selecting it. Sometimes, you know, depending on the image, it does a much better job. Let's see if we have another image that we can use. Let's try this astronaut. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but we're going to see. Phew. The more complex the image, the less likely it's to work perfectly, but not bad, right? Then you can go into select and mask at the top and really kind of edit some of these little bits out right here, right? With the refine selection tool. Not bad. So object selection does a pretty good job. All right. So we've gone ahead and, okay, there we go. Now we have a little bit more legibility, right? And I can double click and, you know, make some changes to this. And that's looking a little bit better, right? All right, now these buttons are looking a little bit small, to be honest. Now that I kind of went away from it, came back, looking a little bit small. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna go to our main component in our default state. I'm gonna grab this text layer and let's bump this up to 24. And because we have padding enabled, it's gonna keep that padding and it's going to distribute that to our various layers, right? Even our states as well. Beautiful. Now, like I mentioned earlier, these buttons are not going to be displayed initially. Now, there might be one more thing I might want, and let me actually go ahead and launch Nucleo. Oops. All right, there's a new version. No, not right now. Kind of busy, Nucleo. And let's look for, I think there's a nice shooting star inside of Font Awesome's library. So I'm going to grab that actually and pop that directly in this group of buttons. And we can almost use this as like a favorites icon, right? So instead of your typical star or heart, we can use this kind of fun shooting star. There we go. And we've got our path in there, and that looks kind of fun, right? 24, beautiful. Okay, so like I mentioned, these buttons will not be displayed initially. When someone taps on this particular state to expand this series, those buttons are going to make an appearance. So what we want to do is we want to initially mask them out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this image here and I'm going to duplicate it so I have the exact same shape, and I'm going to move it on top of all the other objects. And now what I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and change the color to something else, and I'll tell you why. Actually, let me not do that so I can show you what might happen, just so you're aware of this. I'm going to go ahead and select all this information. So I have this image at the top, which we're going to be using as a mask, and I'm also going to select all the information below it that we want inside of the mask. And someone's asking, I saw you use a font called Adobe Sans. So it might have been Adobe Clean, which I was using at some point for a project. That is a proprietary font, but there are some Adobe fonts that are available to the public, I believe. All right, so I've gone ahead and selected all the information, and typically you go up to the object menu and then mask with shape. But right now it's grayed out, and that's because the layer at the very top, which we want to use as a mask, already has a mask, right? So you can't use a mask for a mask, and there's an image masked inside of it. Even though it's not an object mask, it's still masked. So I'm going to just change the color to anything, and then select all the information one more time, object, mask with shape. It's going to place everything that we had selected underneath that layer at the top and mask it in. Sands of Time. Now, what I can do is I can dive in here, grab this group of buttons, and simply shift it downwards so that it's masked out so we can't see it initially, right? I can make sure I can move this down a little bit. There we go. That's looking pretty good. All right, so we have our first series looking pretty good. Now we may want to create some additional ones. And what we can do is we can actually just duplicate this particular series. Command or Control D. You can also turn it into a component if you want, but there's going to be a lot different on it, so I'm going to keep these ones separate, but they're all going to go inside of a larger component at some point. So I'm going to duplicate Command or Control D. This will be End of Times. I'm going to grab some copy on my other document here. And there we go. The end of, let me actually go ahead and make this a fixed height or auto height, something like that. of times. And let's say this is maybe it's not so much of a drama, it's more sci-fi. Delete that, and you're noticing when I did that, everything else after it kind of just shifted on in. Maybe this one has 14 episodes. Maybe it was released in 2020. And it's also HD. Now, of course, the image has to change. So I'm going to dive into Finder one more time. And let's see. So we've got some great looking images here. We've got some also fantasy images here. What image looks good that we can use? This one looks pretty fancy. And boop. Bam. All right. View. All right. That looks pretty good. Interesting. I don't know about you. Would you watch this? I would watch this show. Especially with all the typeface puns. Who doesn't love a typeface pun? There we go. Now there's a little bit of readability issues there. We can definitely tweak as needed, but we're going to keep it at that for now. I'm going to duplicate this again. And this one's going to be all about Futura. Grab this image. Nope. Oh, I wasn't inside of the mask. There we go. Much better. All right, let me grab some more copy that I have somewhere over here. And this one is going to be called Back to the Futura. I'm sure we've all heard that joke at some point in our lives. This one might have 6 episodes or 7 or whatever. Maybe 2021. Perfect. All right, if anyone in the chat does know some fun typeface puns, throw it in there. All right, so we have our 3 different series. We have our Back to the Futura, we have End of Times, and we have the Sands of Times, right? Now, we're not going to focus too much on the End of Times and Futura, but we do want to create an expanded state for the Sands of Times. And at this point, what we want to do is take all 3 of these series and place them into a larger component. Now, initially, these ones over here are actually going to be kind of hidden. So we're going to actually move this over to the right, and we'll have it about 16 pixels from the one in the middle and this one as well. And if we wanted to, we can also maybe move this up a little bit, resize it a touch. Responsive resize does a really great job. Oh, I didn't do any boops today. Boop. Hold on. Where's the button? Did it work? There it is. There's the boop. It looks like there's a little bit of a green screen issue right there. I will fix that for next time. Right, so we can do that as well, but we're going to keep it at this. That looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all 3 of these masks, and I'm going to turn this into a larger component. And we have our default state, which I'm going to call series. And then we can go ahead and create a new state. And this will be called Sans Expanded. There we go. All right, so we have that looking pretty good. And now what we want to do, now that we have our Sans Expanded series and state selected, we're gonna dive in here. We want to make sure to expand our mask as well. Let's actually move this on. Actually, we don't have to move it on top. So we're going to select the mask. We're going to make sure that it fits the entire width and length of our artboard. We're going to grab our image. We're going to do the exact same thing. Phew. Just like that. We can maybe move these. We can also double click on the image to adjust the mask as well, if we wanted to, a little bit. There we go. And then we can grab our buttons or any other information that may be part of that mask and shift it on up. Just like that, right? So we have now our default state and we have our expanded state. And next week, we're going to get into prototyping this design. So we're not going to touch too much on that today because we do have more things to design. But we also want to create what it looks like when, we cycle over to the End of Times and also Back to the Futura. So I'm going to press the plus button one more time. We're going to create End of Times. And simply, I'm going to dive in here, grab these objects, and shift it on over. I also have my guides that I can use Now, one more thing I should probably do is back in this state here, we have these cards that are kind of popping, they're still there, right? So I'm just gonna grab them and just shift them on over. There we go. And when we do get to the process of using auto animate, they're going to just kind of slide on over. All right, so we have end of times. That looks pretty good. Now, possibly to give this a little bit more style, what we can do is also animate the mask. So in the default state, I may want to select this image here and possibly, maybe move this astronaut over to the right. Maybe make him or her a little bit smaller, right? Just so that we can possibly see a little bit of that astronaut peeking on over. We might need to give it a little bit more room, but that's okay, right? And then end of times in here, we'll want to just put the astronaut back in the middle. There we go. What typography is that, Javier is asking? That is the Montserrat alternative typeface. Why do you use a mask and not a group? Okay, so Paul, that's a good question. So in this case, let me go back to my default state. In this case, it depends on what your goal is, right? So we have our default state where we have our show at the top, in this case, the Sands of Times, and we only want some of the information to be displayed when we're just kind of browsing through it. We don't want to overload the user with buttons and episodes and things like that. So we have our expanded state, whoops, this one here, which has more information. And I would probably also put like an episode list down here at the bottom. You can use repeat grids for that and things like that. So using a mask, like I'm doing right now, allows me to still have those objects down there, which is going to be important once we actually get to prototyping and auto animate. So I can have them down there, but they're masked out. And that's why I'm using a mask. If I wasn't concerned about having additional objects come into play when the series is expanded, then a group or a component would absolutely do. But in this case, I kind of want that mask so that we can have some objects that are out of view. All right. So that's looking pretty good. Now down below here, we'll get back to some of this stuff in a moment, but we may want maybe some additional categories, for example, right? So what we're going to do is we have our guides. Now I might want to actually drag another guide. It's a little bit squishy on the side, especially if we're going to add some categories. So let's say 32, maybe 40 pixels. Let's do 40 pixels on each side. And I may even consider bringing this in, just so I have a little bit more room for the shows on the side. Something like that, right? Oops. There we go. All right. That looks a little bit better. All right, so what I'm going to do is I want maybe 3 categories down here at the bottom that users can browse. So I'm going to grab my rectangle. And I do want 3, right? So you might be thinking, okay, you can put 1 rectangle here, and then you can duplicate eventually and duplicate, and that kind of works. But if you want to really make sure that it's going to fit, what I like to do is grab this rectangle, and let me just change the color so you can see it. Right? So drag a rectangle across the entire width. In this case, it's from this guide over here to that guide over there. And then within the properties inspector, you can actually do some math, right? Because I can't do math in my head, so I'm going to just simply divide by 3. This one right here. Boop. And then if I were to simply leave it at this, then we'd have 3 that perfectly align, right? But we want a little bit of padding in there. So I'm simply now going to minus, let's say 8, right? And now if we do something like a repeat grid, we'll have some padding. I might want a little bit more padding in there. So let's do minus 16. And then eventually, we'll have some nice padding in there. Look at that. Beautiful. Ew, math. I agree. Math is not my strong suit. All right. Now on top of this, we may want some text. So this might say something like sci-fi thrillers. Makes it a little bit larger so it's nice and legible. Extra bold. Now this one we can center this text, it would make sense. And we're going to change the color to white. Now we may also run into, like we did previously with this at the top, we may run into, depending on the images in the background, some issues where we might have to kind of tweak or add some overlays, but we'll get there in a second. Now, I did mention that you can use a repeat grid, right? View. But we may not want to in this case. And that's because we may want to add some hover effects, and we may want to add some like moving shadows or reflections or things like, we might want to get a bit fancy with this. So in this case, we're actually going to be using nothing. We could use a stack, of course. Did you just do math in the sizing? I did, Sean. Yeah, so in the fields, I believe you can do this also in Photoshop as well now, but in these width and height fields, you can do math. Actually, many of these fields you can. So if you wanted, let's say, what's another example? Maybe you have a border, right? And you have size of 1, maybe you want to times by 10 for whatever reason. Now it's 10, right? So you can do math in many of these fields in XD, and I think Photoshop, you can do that as well. So I can go ahead and also turn this into a stack if I wanted to kind of have control, but some of them will be larger when hovering takes place, so I'm not going to do that right now. This will be, let's say, category, just like that. All right, and let's grab an image. Let's grab this image here and boop, there, aha. So, right, you see kind of what we're dealing with. We do have a little bit of an issue. So this kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier. You know, what's the best way to tackle this? Do we add an overlay on top? Do we add an overlay at the bottom? Do we bring this into Photoshop? Now, I think something like this, probably not necessary for Photoshop, to be honest. So in this case, I'm simply going to grab this. I'm going to duplicate it, call this overlay. We'll go ahead and set the fill to black, and then we can really start tweaking the colors. I can also set a border, a little bit of a border, and I'm going to drop the opacity. Let's try, I don't know, 35 possibly. And I'm also going to drop the opacity of the border so it's, you know, a nice subtle border, a little bit of a bevel. Can you create a component inside another component? So you can create a component in a component in a component. You can just keep nesting them if you want to. Next week, I believe, we're going to talk a lot about that. And yes, so the answer is yes, you can definitely do that. And, you know, with nested components, as of last Adobe Max, there have been many updates that allow you to have nested hover, whole lot of cool things. All right, so we have this looking a little bit better. And what I might also want to do, it's not going to be displayed initially, is have a fun little shadow underneath, but not your typical shadow. I'm going to actually duplicate this image. I'm going to call it shadow. It's not really a shadow. I'm going to move it down. But in this case, what we want to do is actually blur it a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to an object blur down here in the properties inspector. And let's say 25 pixels or 24, sure. And then we might want to experiment with some blend modes. Maybe hard light and then drop the opacity, maybe about 80%, right? So you can imagine that when this card is hovered over top of, this shadow kind of comes down, right? And it has this fun little effect. It's kind of neat, isn't it? I'm gonna pull that on in just a touch. But initially I don't want it to be seen, so I'm gonna just drag it on up. All right, so we have our first one looking pretty good. And now what we want is we want to create our second. So I'm going to duplicate that over. We can also create our third as well if we wanted to, right? And you can, again, you can do this in a stack. You can do this in a repeat grid, but because I'm going to be using hover effects at some point, I'm going to keep them outside of repeat grid at the moment. This one is going to be explore new worlds. And then for the image, in Finder, I can grab this one. I'm going to copy it to my clipboard because if I did drag this directly in, because we have that overlay on top, it's going to replace the overlay, which we don't want. So I can either hide the overlay or copy it. And then on here, I can paste appearance, which is going to put that image directly in. And I'll do the same thing for the shadow. There we go. And then this one over here to the right, lose yourself. And this one, this little guy here, is floating in space. Doesn't look like a good situation he's got himself in, but you know, there we go. All right, beautiful. Now, there are a few ways we can set this up. And if we're thinking about hover effects, right? We can do each one as a hover effect, or we can put all of them into a larger component and, you know, have basically have each state. It's a little bit more complicating. So what we can do here is we have this thrillers one. I'm going to create a component, and all we're going to do is we're going to grab, let's say, the overlay and this image. We're going to make it a little bit larger, just a little bit, nothing too crazy, right? Let's also drag out a guide from the top, just so that we know for the other ones, we have a bit of a reference. And then we're going to grab the shadow, and we're going to shift it on down. Oh, I just edited the default state. All right, we're all good. We are all good. Let's do that one more time. I did it on purpose. I did not. All right, so we have our default state, but we also want to create a hover state. So I'm going to press the plus button, create a hover state, which is automatically going to be wired up by default. And now we can dive in and select our layers, make them a little bit larger. Let's grab another guide, boop, and then our shadow, and drag that on down as well, right? There we go. Now this one over here, we're going to do the same thing. And you can do these as instances of the main component, or you can do these as separate components. I like keeping things separate sometimes, so that's why I'm doing that. But everyone works differently, so you can definitely work however you like. There we go. In this one, create a component, Command and Control K, create a hover state. It was the plan all along. Cody knows. There we go. All right, so again, we're gonna get into prototyping more next week, but we now have hover effects. Now, even though they're wired up by default, you can still go into prototype mode and, let's say, select all these objects and just tweak this a little bit. So if you don't really care about the animation too much, you can actually switch this from auto animate to transition and then no animation, and then you can hover much quicker, right? I like a little bit of animation, so let's go auto animate. Maybe we don't need any easing, and we'll do like 0.2 seconds so that the animation is a little bit faster. We can do like 0.1 second, right? Or let's say, maybe we'll do a little bit of easing, ease in and out, right? A lot of different ways you can do it, but that looks interesting. And we have those fun little shadows at the bottom. All right, so let's go ahead and tackle a few additional items that we may want. Maybe we want a menu icon at the top left-hand corner. So for here, very simple. Of course, you can grab an icon, but I do have my line tool selected. Drag out a line, zoom on in, make this line a little bit thicker, maybe a little bit more. There we go, menu icon. Fancy, right? Nothing too crazy. I guess if you do want to get a little bit creative with this, let's see if I have any icons. Planet, do I have any? Ooh, I have a ring icon here. Let's try this. Let's get a little bit fancy with this. I don't know if this is gonna work, but we're gonna try it. Now these are all SVGs, so I should be able to grab this. Yes, okay. I'm going to copy that. We don't need that. Bring this on in. Let's see if it works. I don't know if it might not, right? I'm also going to group our menu. We've got our ring. Definitely with enough time, you can do something interesting and different. How much time do we have? About 5 minutes left? I think so. What icon manager am I using? I am using Nucleo. The icon manager is free, and I do have some icon sets that I've purchased over the years or have acquired in various ways. So I have those loaded in. Nucleo does have their own icons that you can purchase. I think it's $99 possibly, but the actual icon manager is free, and this is the beta of version 3, which is kind of fancy. They've done a nice job with it. There we go. And down here, maybe we can add a point and then curve it on up. Just to get a little bit fancier with this icon. It's probably not worth the time, to be honest, but it's fun to do. Not bad. And then what we can also do, just to give a little bit of separation, because it's, you know, white on white, is I can duplicate this one, and maybe I'll change the fill to this black color. I'll move it behind and just kind of push it back. And then I can dive into the path, move these on up, move this one down a touch, and then we have a little bit of separation. You can see it right up the top. It's not perfect, but pretty fun. Who's going to be the DCC host after Brandon? You know what? I do not know at the moment, but I'm sure that will be announced at some point. All right. Perfect. All right, so we have our menu, and of course, you know, as this prototype evolves, we'll be able to add different states to our menu so that when it's tapped on, a whole menu from the left kind of slides out. But we may want to add a few additional items up here at the top, maybe some links. If you're familiar with, you know, YouTube TV or Apple TV, there are sometimes some like subcategories up at the top. So this one up here might be for you. It's a little bit large. Let's drop that to about, let's try 32. Oh, no, it's still too big. 24 maybe? Oops. 24. Possibly. I think extra bold is throwing it off. Let's try semi-bold. Possibly. We'll see. And then we might want to pop this into a group, which I'll just call links, and then turn a stack on. That way I can just add some additional ones. We'll do 4 in total. Movies, and then TV shows, and then maybe there's a fitness section. Get fit. And let's try 40 pixels in between all of them. And then maybe to highlight that we are on the For You page, we might want a little bit of a line underneath. There we go. Change the color to white, make it a little bit thicker. All right, it is coming along. Not perfect, but it's coming along. Now, going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about gradients and things like that, right now this is not bad, but if we were to switch over to, let's say, End of Times or the Futura one, there might be some issues reading some of that information back there. So, you know, you might want to just grab, let's say, a rectangle, drag one out, guide to guide, and then just add a very subtle gradient back there, right? Both colors will be set to black. But the one at the bottom, you'll want to drop the opacity down to 0. Make sure it's underneath our links. And then you can experiment with the opacity a little bit. You might not need it 100%, maybe 50% possibly. There you go. Just adds a little bit of separation back there. Looks pretty good. All right, now finally over to the right-hand side, we may want possibly, you know, the time. So maybe this is, what time is it now? It's like 12:53 Pacific time, and then PM. Maybe I'll make this one a little bit smaller. There we go. And then maybe, let's see if there's any weather icons. Weather or sun. Drop that down. All right. Perfect. And then maybe far over to the right, maybe there's also a way to interact with this prototype using your voice. So let's find a microphone. And I should also mention, this one's pretty good, but I should also mention that if you don't have access to an icon library, you can go to your plugins panel at the bottom, and you can access the Icons for Design plugin. So in this case, you might want to type out something like microphone or mic, and there's all sorts of microphones that you can definitely use. There we go. Pop this over to the right, give it a little bit of padding on that side. And then maybe to separate all of these, we may want maybe a very simple line. Drag it on down, change the color to white, maybe thicken it up a touch, and maybe we'll experiment with the dashes just to have a little bit of fun in there. maybe round them out, increase the gap. Yeah, it's okay. Let's try, actually, maybe we'll make them circular. There we go. That looks interesting. And the same thing we did before, we can go ahead and pop all these layers into a group. Command and Control G. I'm going to call this, what do I call this? Top right. It's not very original, but we're going to run with it. And we're going to turn a stack on, and we can set this to, let's say 40, right? Maybe that's a bit too much. 32. The magic number. And there we go. So just like that, we started the process of building out this media browsing experience for the television, possibly consoles as well. I'm gonna be back next week. We're gonna start bringing this thing to life, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. So thanks so much for watching, everyone. Stick around in just a few minutes. Kyle T. Webster is coming up with his illustration masterclass, so stick around for that, and I will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.